we have an economic justice panel starting right now. Dick, if you want to stay on, since you've had a lot to say on that issue as well, because you and I obviously agree on so many things. If you would like to stay on, that would be so appreciated if you have the chance. And I wanted to introduce to everyone our amazing panelists for.
I think I'm going to have to sign off, but
okay.
Thanks.
Sorry, thank you.
Okay.
Bye. And we wanted to make sure that we introduce our panelists. The first one is our amazing friend, Andy Morrison, with the New Economy Project. He has spoken on our panel many times regarding economic justice, and I wanted to say thank you and welcome back. We wanted to welcome Jennifer Sun with AAFE. She's the ED there, and that's Asian Americans for Equality, who is working a lot with our small businesses in their recovery. And also Ricky Silver with Empire State Indivisible, who has been kind of one of the leaders on the budget justice conversation. I also wanted to give a moment before the panel starts to my friend Luke Wolf, who's representing Scott Stringer's office and has been very, very supportive. So Luke, can you give a couple of seconds, because we are running a little late. So.
Of course, I will keep this brief. Once again, my name is Luke Wolf. I'm with City Comptroller Scott Stringer's office. I want to start by thanking the Assembly member for putting this together, but also for all of her tireless work, especially talking about this panel on economic justice. We could not ask for a better partner fighting for that day in and day out. So we thank the Assembly member for all of your incredible work fighting for economic justice at the state level and also here in the city as well. And I just want to very briefly touch upon some of the work our office has been doing. Specifically around this economic justice issue, but also to do with COVID more broadly. So we've published 2 comprehensive reports during this time period focusing on COVID. The first is on who are the city's frontline health workers. And what we found was that the majority of them are women, many of them are immigrants, many of them are undocumented, many of them are low income. And we put together a whole package of steps the city does need to take to make sure that these people are supported. We also did a second report outlining what are all the disparities that impact who is more deeply affected by COVID. So looked at housing, health, air quality, food security, and all the other issues that we've seen across our city, and which communities are more drastically impacted. And we also, once again, outlined a number of steps to remedy many of those disparities to make sure that during this crisis and going forward, we can build a stronger and more stable economy for everyone across the city. Another thing that we did this week was we launched a campaign through our labor law department calling for a number of workers to be given the unclaimed funds and the unclaimed wages, which they have earned, but they have not been given. So we have millions of dollars that we have claimed over the years, and we are making a really concerted effort to make sure that money ends up back in workers' hands, because this is money that they worked for, they earned, but they did not end up receiving. So our labor law and labor outreach departments are putting that campaign in motion right now to make sure that happens. One other thing I want to talk about is, of course, as the coronavirus crisis is ongoing, we still have the climate change crisis ongoing as well. And last week was Earth Week, so we took a number of steps around Earth Week and climate justice too. The first thing is we called on all the major insurance companies to stop their business with the coal industry, which is poisoning our planet and really has been a horrible offender, and making sure that future generations are not given the climate that they need and the environment that they need. The second is we led a successful Vote No campaign against a JP Morgan director who had a history of climate denialism. They wanted to put this individual in a very senior position, and we led in a Vote No campaign so that person did not end up getting the position, which is very important. We don't have climate deniers in those positions of power. Number 3, we called for the stoppage of construction of the Keystone Pipeline, which is right now an unnecessary and dangerous construction to do. So we've taken a number of steps related to Earth Week and continuing to focus on the overall climate justice movement as we are also focusing on the coronavirus crisis as well. So once again, I want to thank the Assembly member for all of her amazing work, and I'm looking forward to listening to this panel with all the other great advocates as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. And I just wanted to, again, just kind of highlight the fact that in Chinatown, our small businesses really felt the economic impacts of COVID-19 long before the rest of the state. with the business district that really depends heavily on the restaurant industry and foot traffic to bring in revenue. Our Chinatown businesses and our Chinatown business owners all across my district really kind of were devastated by COVID-19 and also the second epidemic that we need to face and deal with, which is racism, xenophobia, and anti-Asian sentiment. And we know that with there's no clear end in sight, and there's a long recovery ahead. Even though we were hit the hardest, we're going to have the hardest time recovering as well. And we have to ensure that we have the resources and that we can stay afloat. Many of my residents in my district have been laid off, furloughed, left without resources to support themselves and their families. They're having a hard time even applying for benefits, for unemployment. They can't even get onto the line. A lot of folks cannot pay rent. A lot of people cannot pay for very basic food items, services, etc. This is, not, folks who have even traditionally been needing SNAP benefits, unemployment benefits, etc. It's just folks just are in a very different scenario right now, and we must at all levels of government really implement more efficient and effective support networks for those who are the most vulnerable in this pandemic. We've seen some good things in the budget. Obviously, one of the biggest wins for myself personally was the CDFI fund was finally funded. We've been fighting for that for a very, very long time, but obviously funding it now and funding it 3 years ago is a very large difference. If we had funded it 3 years ago, we would have built a very large network, and we would have been able to have a very large pipeline to help people to get the help that they need from our community financial development institutions in order to be that pipeline for things like the PPP, and we would have been able to dole things out a lot fairer than I think that the big banks would have done. And I think that we need to talk a little bit about some of the things that weren't funded and things that were not raised, because right now obviously we did not do any revenue raising. Our budget had no revenue raisers, and we desperately needed to make sure that we raised revenue in this time to be able to fund things that we had talked about earlier, which is like healthcare and things that we're going to talk about later, which is like education. And we desperately needed that social safety net that we are basically the things that are keeping folks alive now. And we haven't had any of the help on the federal level that we needed. We haven't had any of the help on the state level that we had hoped to be able to bring in with our budget. And now we're very, very much making a choice to let things hurt people rather than taking or cushioning the blow on the government level. And so I think that, this is a long time, this is very much a discussion that we need to have. And today we have some amazing folks to discuss that right now. One of the things that we wanted to kind of start with, I guess, is some of the impacts of unemployment, some of the things that have been hitting the economy, and some of the trickle down and that our budget is going to cause. So I'll start with Ricky on the budget justice agenda, and then I'll go to Andy to look at some of the things that we are hoping to I guess, or some of the domino effect things that are happening, and then we'll go to Jennifer to talk about some of the small business things that we're seeing already, and then some of the residential and community things that we're seeing on the ground level. So I'm going to mute you, Jennifer, and I'm going to allow Ricky to be unmuted. So Ricky, go ahead.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here. Yeah, so as part of the very large and sort of statewide Budget Justice Coalition, we've been working with the Assembly member and a number of other allies in the Assembly and the Senate, pushing for the need to raise additional revenue at the state level to fund the services and the critical needs of our communities. These needs existed prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. We were and remain ranked #1 in inequality as a state. And so the need to raise revenue, asking the wealthiest New Yorkers to chip in more, to ensure that our state would reverse that devastating inequality was really critical. And when the pandemic hit, we've seen ultimately the issues of that inequality come, totally laid bare in terms of how devastating the circumstances are for people that have been left behind by our state government and, quite frankly, our federal government. And so, in the moment, sort of in response to what happened at the budget, we were very disappointed to see the lack of a willingness to discuss additional revenue raisers to offset the shortfalls that we know that the pandemic is causing. But we continue to push and we continue to fight to make that case. We know there are major shortfalls due to the pandemic. And so now more than ever, do we need to see our state government, the governor in particular, support the need to raise more revenue. Separately, I want to stress that right now there are billions and billions and billions of dollars flowing through the federal government, more money than we've ever seen, attempting to respond to the crisis. The initial attempts to do so, the first 3 stimulus packages, had some important and necessary funding measures that made its way to New York, but fell woefully short to address the crisis on the ground. And so at the same time, the same coalition is now fighting for what we're calling the people's recovery, to really push to ensure that the funds that are coming from the federal government make their way directly to the people that need it, that are meant to address the crises we're seeing of affordability, of a loss of income. We've already had a homelessness crisis in this state, in this city in particular, and that is only accelerating. And so I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about how folks can get involved, but would love to pass it off to the other panelists as well.
So I'm going to call on Andy next.
Great. So it's great to be here, and I hope everyone is staying as healthy and safe as they can under the circumstances. And I'm at New Economy Project. We've worked closely with Assemblymember Niou on a number of efforts and really appreciate her leadership on economic justice. It's tremendous, and certainly she rises above many of her peers in this regard, doing really good work on economic justice in New York State for New Yorkers. I guess, thinking about some of the comments that were made around the lack of revenues, revenue raisers, 2 of them that were really good that we would have liked to have seen is taxes on Wall Street. One of the Assembly members' bills would have taxed stock buybacks, which kind of manufacture inflated stock prices that really go to CEOs so that they can take more of the pie, as if they don't have enough already. And then there's another one that would have put a very modest tax on stock transfers, which the state already collects and then returns back. So it kind of makes no sense, and it would have meant billions and billions and billions of dollars. And I think from our perspective, when you look at the behavior of the banks in this crisis, it's really appalling what the big banks have been up to. For example, with the paycheck protection, the paycheck protection loans that the federal government made available to small businesses, some of the biggest banks participating were kind of rigging the system. Instead of taking small businesses on a first come, first serve basis, as you would expect they would, they were kind of cherry picking the biggest loans for the businesses that maybe weren't the hardest hit, because that's where the biggest fees were.
VIPs, the
yes.
VIP suites.
Exactly. It's almost like having like a little VIP line that they got to cut in front of everybody else. And that's just one example. There were examples of banks garnishing stimulus checks from people who had gotten their stimulus checks, which obviously people desperately need funds in this moment. And if they had had a negative balance on their account for whatever reason, the banks were using the opportunity to take that money from them in this moment, if you can imagine that. And so that kind of brings me to what I really wanted to start off with in terms of the domino effect that the Assembly member touched on at the opening, is what at New Economy Project, we have a financial justice hotline. And I'll give the number out a couple times, 212-925-4929. And it's a free legal services line for low-income New Yorkers. And we do our best to help people when they're experiencing, whether it's predatory lending or abusive debt collection. And what we've been seeing over the past month or so is that many New Yorkers are having their wages garnished or their bank accounts frozen by debt collectors. And so people who, and we've created a story bank where we're sort of chronicling New Yorkers' stories, firsthand accounts of what they're going through in this moment. And we're finding that people will go to the store to buy food or personal protective equipment or medicine, and they try to use their debit card, and they suddenly find out that there's a lien on their bank account because of a debt. And so we've been calling on the governor to use his emergency powers, which are broad, to put a hold on debt collection. And it needs to be even beyond the crisis, because getting to the domino effect, we're just at the beginning of what's going to be a unspeakable crisis for thousands upon thousands upon thousands of low-income New Yorkers. And as we know, the communities of color throughout the city have been hardest hit. And so we really need to be thinking big about how to address this and how we can support low-income and communities of color throughout the city. So that's been our perspective from what we've seen through our hotline especially. And I'll leave it there. I know we want to get to CDFIs, and there's a number of other things in the budget to discuss, but wanted to kick it off with that.
Thank you for mentioning the canceled debt whole agenda on that front, because we've also seen a lot of folks who, in the middle of having to stay home, get their debit cards and their credit cards completely canceled and completely frozen. And so it's very difficult for folks to have no access to a way to be able to even order anything online or anything like that. So it's very difficult. And thank you so much, Andy, for bringing that up. Next is Jennifer Sun.
Hi, Eileen. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this conversation today, so thanks for having me. So I'm the co-executive director of Asian Americans for Equality, a community-based organization with offices in Manhattan, Chinatown, Jackson Heights, and Flushing. And we also have a small business CDFI, or Community Development Financial Institution. And through that experience of operating a CDFI, we've really experienced both the real disparities in how the federal program and financial assistance to small businesses was very inequitable in its first round, and how important community-based organizations are in being able to provide culturally and linguistically appropriate services to really connect financial assistance to those who need it most. I also want to really acknowledge the Assembly members' particular focus and advocacy on behalf of CDFIs. I will say that, I think as the Assembly member acknowledged, Asian small businesses have been feeling the impact of the pandemic since late January, really around Chinese New Year, when a lot of the news of the pandemic in China began to really hit our shores. There was a really sharp decline in revenue for businesses in hospitality, food, restaurants, retail, wholesale, travel, really sort of across all of the sectors that are the backbone of the economies of neighborhoods across the city. Over half of the people who are employed in our city are employed by small businesses. And we know from our clients at Renaissance EDC that over 50% of them are actually in the accommodations, food retail business and wholesale business. And so we really saw immediately sort of the significant economic impact that Asian small businesses had, with both a decline in foot traffic, but also in a lot of decline in even local residential support for small business activity. And so had both an upstream effect with their supply chains, as well as in direct to consumer sales. And so, because of the advocacy of the assembly member and other elected officials, I think in the second round of the PPP program, there was a broader recognition of how important CDFIs would be in making sure that the federal assistance really got to small business owners. And so we were happy to see that there was a greater allocation of the PPP funding that was being provided to CDFIs for disbursement. But I'll say that even in the week that we've been, dispersing funds directly as a PPP lender, it's been really frustrating still to work with the federal government. Their website crashed. It was really hard to even be able to upload applications, and the approval process was really, really slow. And so I think it's also really exposed how the lack of investment at the federal government in their own IT infrastructure and in their processes for being able to provide access in the most streamlined way possible. It's also another big area that needs to be a focus as elected officials continue to think about beyond the immediate recovery, sort of longer term investment that needs to happen, both in community development organizations, in cities, but also in IT infrastructure at the federal level too.
So I wanted to also mention, so thank you, Jennifer, for talking a little bit about CDFIs. I just wanted to go over it for folks who are at home and don't know exactly what the acronym means. A CDFI is a Community Development Financial Institution, and actually the history of it's very cool. There's a couple of articles out there. My friend Oscar wrote one, and you guys should look it up actually, but the history of it is that New York State actually is one of the only states in the entire nation that has its own New York State CDFI fund infrastructure that is already kind of out there, but we have never funded it. And so this is the first year that we funded it in this budget. It was $25 million, which is like a little tiny pool of money that will actually make it so that there's money for the, that it actually just needs to sit there. What it needs to do is just sit there so that our credit unions, our CDFIs can grow and make sure that they have something to be able to lend off of, right? So it's not even like the money itself has to be lent out, it has to be like lent off of. And it's supposed to be something that will help them to be able to expand and grow their network. And so if we had had that network in the years that we had advocated for it, it would have grown and really been robust by that time. But now, I mean, still our CDFIs are functioning at an incredible level. I think that, we still have the infrastructure to be able to do, the community outreach that's needed to get, the funding and the, and the federal dollars to the places that we know that it needs to go. But at the same time, I think that it'll be very, very difficult to scale up the way that we hope that it would in this short runway of time. I think that right now it's good that we funded it for the first time, but obviously we need to be more foresight oriented in our budget processes. I also wanted to kind of go back to Ricky a little bit and talk about revenue raisers. And I also wanted to talk about how right now a lot of folks in my district have seen price gouging. There's been a lot of consumer protection issues that have happened. There's been predatory lenders that have been out there who have been growing massively and benefiting greatly off of the backs of the poorest and the most vulnerable people, because people are getting desperate for keeping a roof over their heads right now, and people are getting desperate for getting food on their table, and people are getting desperate for making ends meet in a time when there's the most unemployment that we've ever experienced. And so I think that we need to have that discussion about what are some of the things that are going on that are predatory, some of the things that our seniors are going through, and some of the things that need to be stopped, collection agency wise, et cetera. And I'm going to hit that with Andy, but let's talk about revenue raisers and possibilities with Ricky right now.
Yeah, and I'll say also, just in terms of what the community is going through, in some ways it's been inspiring to watch the sort of mutual aid type networks that have been built up and the volunteer base that's coming in. But what I think we all need to recognize is the fact that there is such a gaping hole for the needs that are there right now suggests that the system was broken before. The system was not prepared to manage this type of a crisis. People were already struggling. And so I've personally, every moment of inspiration has been met with just despair as we've watched these networks build up because they're simply not sufficient. And so thinking ahead,
it's designed this way, that it's not broken, it's
sorry, apologies.
designed.
The other thing that I think is a good reference point or like a jumping off point for that is thinking about foresight is, like I mentioned, the need for revenue existed prior to the pandemic. The need to address the fact that the state was #1 in inequality was there before. And so I think in terms of the opportunities ahead, the ability to raise revenue, we've heard a couple from Andy earlier from, for example, Wall Street type taxes, but there's a number of taxes out there that target the very top earners in the state and ask them simply to pay a little bit more. So for example, there's an ultra millionaires tax being proposed that's been out. Actually, the Assembly has supported it in the past, and for whatever reason, we simply haven't been able to get it over the finish line, which would adjust the brackets only on the highest earning potentials. There's a few different versions of that out there. For example, though, if you make more than $5 million, the bracket above that $5 million would go up. Unfortunately, the governor suggested that that would be impossible to do in a moment like this. But if you're earning more than $5 million still today, surely there's an opportunity for you to chip in more to make sure our state has what it needs. There's other taxes out there that have been proposed, like, for example, a pied-à-terre tax that would tax second homes, over millions of dollars in worth, that again would drive billions of dollars overall, this package that we've been talking about, the Budget Justice Coalition. So there's a number of options out there. As an activist and speaking to those on the call that are community members, what I'd say is, it's not ultimately up to us to determine the exact solution. Obviously, we do our part in the coalition to work with legislators like Yulene to come up with the right policy, but we need to see urgency from our elected officials on this issue. Assemblymember Niou has been phenomenal at creating that urgency, but we need to see it from the others, and we need to see a willingness to go back and address it head on. One thing I also want to flag or just discuss openly, and I think there was a question in the chat about this, was sort of, we know the budget process is one in which our legislators have a lot less power than they should. And curious, we can certainly discuss that, what needs to happen longer term. But I think the question I would sort of pose is, in this moment where the legislators really have the power to go back and advance new revenue opportunities, we know it's possible that maybe the governor doesn't agree with those things, but I'd like to see, and again, I'm grateful for Assemblymember Niou's allyship on this, but I'd like to see the legislature do their job and actually push through additional revenue waivers in the moment. Public school education is a great point to think about what's going to happen long term, right? We have short-term immediate needs right now, there's no question, but the cuts that are being discussed to the public school system because of the lack of revenue right now will have impact for decades and decades, right? The same thing that happened in the healthcare system that led to this pandemic is we're on the precipice of the public education system if these cuts go through. So the reason we weren't equipped to manage the pandemic at the healthcare in the healthcare system was largely because we had been cutting our healthcare system for the last decade, right? And so whoever said it perfectly, whoever said it perfectly. We need foresight. We also need some urgency. And so I know we're lucky to have Assemblymember Niou who has both of those things, but hopefully more of her colleagues come to the table on that.
And Andy, I know that I wanted to have you talk a little bit about consumer protection and some of the predatory practices that have been going on, but I also wanted to add in a little bit on what Ricky was saying, because there was a question in the chat about how we've been highlighting the real need to, well, this is directed to me, obviously, and it says, Assemblymember, you've been highlighting the real need to raise revenue, and we are so appreciative of the public stances you've taken around this issue. We know that one of the biggest problems is that the governor has a lot of control over the budget process. Assemblymember Godfrey is carrying a bill that would amend the Constitution to give the legislature more power during this process. Senators Biaggi, Skoufis, and Rivera are carrying it in the Senate. It'll take a few years in order to get this enacted. Do you support this effort? Yes, I'm on the bill, and I don't know if they've put my name on it because they're taking a long time to process those gold slips right now, but the answer is yes, I'm on bill. And do you have any thoughts on what we can do in the meantime to get the governor on board to raise revenue? And I would say that that's a much tougher question. And I think that the answer is actually all of the folks who are here and all of the folks who are at home right now and on the ground, because I think that we really need to make sure that he's held accountable to raising revenue and ask him to. I mean, I've had millionaires call him. We've had millionaires calling his office telling him to tax them. And I'm not really sure what else we can do on that front. And then somebody asked, how will we avoid a veto from the governor on that bill? Will it take a Senate supermajority? I think that, there's a lot of different answers on that front on the process, but there is, a possibility that he would veto it, and it will take 2/3 of the entire legislature to override a veto, just an FYI. Those are just technical questions, but I don't know how to better answer it without getting too political on that front. But the thing is, there is that possibility, and then there is the fact that 2/3 majority can override a veto from the governor. Andy, consumer protection and scary predatory lending stuff that's going on.
Sure. And I'll definitely touch on all of that. I wanted to just start by getting back to this issue of foresight, because we've been talking a lot about that in our work at New Economy Project, where we focus so much on institution building, as well as the work to challenge systems of exploitation, financial exploitation, particularly on low-income communities of color. And but with our work on institution building, it's sort of a moment where you think, as the assembly member was saying before, boy, if we had gotten that CDFI fund funded, when the assembly member was doing a lot of work on it years ago with us, those institutions would be in better shape right now. And by the way, a CDFI is sort of like, one of the things we like about them is a lot of them are community controlled, or in some cases community owned, like the one in Assemblymember Niou's district, the Lower East Side People's Federal Credit Union. It's a financial cooperative. So they function the way banks should function, but don't. With a CDFI, like the Lower East Side People's, you have responsible financial services, a place where people can save their money, and an institution that actually roots wealth locally. So it's keeping the money circulating in the community instead of Wall Street banks, which use tactics like overdraft protection, which sucks billions and billions and billions of dollars from their lowest income customers. If you tallied up the interest rate, for example, and this is something people are experiencing right now in the worst possible time, it would be 17,000% interest. Of course, the Wall Street banks have succeeded in having overdraft protection be considered something other than a loan. So it's not subject to some of the interest rate protections. But can you imagine in this moment getting hit with that kind of a fee? And they collect, again, tens of billions of dollars. And the vast majority of the fees come from the lowest income customers. So that's the world we have. We have rampant debt collection, a rancid industry that preys on the most vulnerable people in communities. We have Wall Street banks which refuse to serve people and in fact are using this opportunity to exploit many small businesses. And because we didn't address these things years ago, now these problems are obviously worse than they might have been had we been getting CDFIs more robust and able to serve more New Yorkers. If we had been working on public banking and making public banking a reality if we had been working on many of these issues. So that's something that's very much something we're paying attention to. And I just want to again plug our financial justice hotline, because if you are experiencing anything, if you're a low-income New Yorker who's getting letters in the mail from a debt collector, or your wages have been garnished, or your bank account's been frozen, we might be able to help you. If you've gotten a charge you don't understand from your bank, or you somehow took out a loan that was predatory, these are the kinds of things that our legal team can support and help you with. So again, the number is 212-925-4929. 212-925-4929.
Amazing. Thank you, Andy. And also, I just wanted to add a plug that for price gouging, the AG does have a hotline for us. It's been very, very helpful in helping to get cases investigated as well. Just for folks' information, my staff will stick that into the chat. And this is a question right before I get back to Jennifer on how small business can get back up. There was a person who asked, and oh, it's Tommy, my favorite. So I didn't say that out loud. I don't play favorites. Yes, I do. But we are told there is billions of dollars that could be raised by legalizing cannabis. What is holding this up, particularly when additional revenue is desperately needed and everyone seems to agree? I'm gonna go to Ricky on that one.
You might know a little bit more on the ins and outs. My understanding of it, at least.
I will talk about the ins and outs.
Yeah. So it's true that the ability to legalize cannabis could bring in a much needed revenue. The biggest issue is that what do we do with those revenues, and how do we set up a legal cannabis industry that recognizes the sort of systemic racism that has led to the over-policing of Black and brown communities, has led to a tremendous amount of disparity in arrests and sentencing on basic use of marijuana. And other states have gone way too quick on this and have made really have set up the industry. The revenue comes in and has never addressed and actually dealt with the systemic issues that were there from the get-go. So I know a number of the discussions are around how to, one, is the industry get set up to account for that. Two, how do the dollars actually go back into the communities that need it and have been most impacted by the prohibition of marijuana? And ultimately, my understanding, and again, Assembly Member, you will be able to speak from the inside perspective. My understanding is that that has never been fully agreed upon, both within the legislature and the governor's office. So it is a shame. 2 years now in a row with a Democratic majority, where other states continue to lap us on this issue. Certainly seems like we should have solved this by now, but curious your perspective, Assembly Member.
I actually, you were very good about putting these bullet points together, but I think one of the biggest things also is that there was no actual, system for the monetary portion of it. And actually, I suggested that CDFI would be a very good system for it. And I actually think that this is a very good connector. And you can actually speak on this a little bit, because there was a lot of research done on it. And we actually feel like that's one of the best ways to be able to put the right mechanisms in place that you were talking about to be able to collect and to disperse revenue. And I think that, it was very interesting that this discussion wasn't had, because we actually had gotten so close. I want to say last year we were the closest we've ever been to legalizing marijuana. But I think that there are a lot of different issues that other legislators had brought up. I feel like, it's a no-brainer. I don't even think that it's very politically difficult anymore. I think that it was something that we've seen other states do over and over again now. And, we also didn't have, like you were saying, Ricky, that the mechanical arm for it. And so, Andy, you can answer a little bit to it as we're going. But
and Andy, I hope you don't mind. I just would jump in with one other thing, which would be, this sort of goes back to the conversation around the budget process and how this probably shouldn't be done within a budget negotiation where the legislature doesn't have a ton of responsibility or power. So, I think would love to see this worked on outside of the budget process and really make sure we set it up for success.
I mean, the only thing I can add, and we worked with the Start Smart Coalition, led by Drug Policy Alliance, which is really an amazing group that has been doing amazing work on this. And I think paramount is that there's a real meaningful equity provision in whatever does get passed eventually. And I think that's been an issue.
Point for sure, because Crystal Peoples-Stokes has a very good equity agenda on it, but on the Senate side and on the governor's side, I believe that there's been more difficulty in reaching that same point, and especially on the governor's side. Yeah, Andy, that was a good point.
Yeah. So, and that, I know that's for us, and we're, obviously taking our lead from the Start folks, others in the Start Smart Coalition who've been leading the way, and Drug Policy Alliance, but that's been key, that if we're gonna, after all the harm that's been inflicted on communities of color because of our just heinous drug laws, that those communities need to be prioritized. And that's where the CDFIs come in, although it's not the only thing that can be done to make sure those communities are prioritized. CDFIs are already stationed in those communities. Many of them are stationed in those communities. They make responsible loans to those communities. So if we want to make sure there's real opportunity for entrepreneurship in communities that have been most harmed by criminalization of cannabis, they could help ensure that those communities are prioritized, and that we don't just have big conglomerates coming in and profiteering off of the new market.
Amazing. And Jennifer, to close us out for this panel. Jennifer, are you there? Oh, you were muted, sorry. Jennifer, you're gonna give us the closing on how we can get out of this.
Yeah, so thinking ahead about the long path for small businesses to recover from this, I think the access to capital that CDFIs provide in really working and providing direct technical assistance to immigrant small business owners and helping them, renegotiate commercial leases, even, working with the city in potentially having to operate differently in order to practice social distancing in order to be able to reopen and have their operations active again. I would envision that there's a need for, again, sort of access to capital, and also working closely with the city in streamlining any permitting processes that could get in the way of small businesses being able to adapt to a very different operating environment. I think another key thing is thinking about the role of small private landlords in a lot of these ethnic neighborhoods. Many of them play an important role in community ownership of assets in immigrant neighborhoods, and actually want a lot of these small businesses to be successful, to be in their neighborhoods as tenants. But small private landlords also face operating costs like insurance, property taxes, and mortgages. And we're finding that a lot of small private commercial landlords also need technical assistance in understanding how to negotiate forbearances with mortgages that they owe. And that also property tax reform is something that the city needs to continue to follow through on. There was a lot of inequities that we had hoped that property tax reform would address, where a lot of luxury residential and commercial developers have received huge property tax abatements, whereas a lot of smaller residential and commercial landlords have paid an inordinate amount of the costs. And so we
very, very red lines.
Yeah. And so I think it's also just remembering sort of the upstream relationship between small businesses and their landlords and the additional financial relief that's necessary, but making sure that if we do provide, property tax abatements, let's say to commercial landlord, that benefit is then passed on directly to tenants as well. But really focusing on creating the conditions for small businesses to either reopen or for new businesses to start as well. And recognizing that, in a post-COVID reality, food retail and retail businesses are not going to be able to do the same level and volume of traffic as they were before. So their overall revenue is going to be lower than what they were receiving. And so that's going to have, a domino effect again on the amount of rent they can pay, on the amount of debt that they can service. And so I think overall, we need to think about an environment that provides as much sort of financial relief, flexibility, and affordability as possible for small businesses to still take the risk of either reopening or starting up again.
That goes back to also bringing up my bills again on commercial rent forgiveness, residential rent forgiveness, and mortgage forgiveness for commercial and residents, and also to make sure that there is a fund for small landlords specifically to be able to recuperate their losses when a third or more of their tenants can't pay. And I think that's really important because, all of the things that you just mentioned, for us to make sure that there is something for our small landlords and for our commercial businesses to be able to be covered. Because right now, there's such a small runway for some of these businesses. And they've already ran out. And so I think that it's really important that we're talking about that. And the other thing that I wanted to point out was that there are some predatory practices that are happening against some of these commercial small businesses and their leases. And I think that there's some things that we need to address on that level as well. So I wanted to say, again, thank you so much to Jennifer and to Ricky and to Andy for joining us today, and also for bringing up some of these very important topics for folks to consider and think about. We can't answer everything, but there's so many things that we need to be doing that we didn't do in our budget. We should have been cushioning the blow for our communities, and we have not. And I think that all of the topics you raised today are exactly the things that we should be changing and doing. So thank you again.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.